As far as I'm concerned, there are a number of things that you may have heard about Martin Luther King that have been characterized to you throughout your education, throughout all the media you've encountered, as being smears against him, which in fact I will go on to show throughout this video are far more accurate than you may have been led to believe. So the first one was that he was a communist. People often say that this was just an FBI smear, and people, when they talk about how this was an FBI smear, to try and refute it, point to a passage in his autobiography/diary where he mentioned about how he disagreed with Marxism because he's Christian, therefore can't be into dialectical materialism. He also made those same claims in a speech that he made in 1962 where he addressed the question of can a Christian be a communist? He addressed that, but we will go on to show that he was actually surrounded constantly by communists, was funded by high-profile communists, and agreed with a large portion of the Marxist doctrine, even if, once again, as we mentioned, he did not have agreement with the atheistic and materialistic views that come bundled up with Marxism. But for all intents and purposes, he was what you could probably describe as a democratic socialist, if we were to use the euphemisms that come along with it.
I think there's a perfect quote that illustrates how to steelman the argument that he was against the communists. He did state that modern man had dutifully worshipped at the shrine of the god of science, that he said that scientific materialism is not the way forward, and he spoke particularly about Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which is a story written in the 19th century about a man who falls asleep and dreams in the 2000s of a Platonic metallurgic socialist society where women raise their children in common and all sorts of nonsense like that. And he says, Bellamy falls victim to the same error that most writers of utopian societies fall victim to, idealism not tempered with realism. In other words, such systems are impractical. Bellamy, with his over-optimism, fails to see that man is a sinner, and that if he is given better economic and social conditions, he will still be a sinner until he submits his life to the grace of God. Ultimately, our problem is a theological one. Communists would insist that the means justify the ends, so if killing 1,000 people will bring about a good end, the act is ethically justifiable. It is at the point that I am radically opposed to communism. Destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends. The mean does not necessarily justify the end, for I would insist that the end is pre-existent in the mean. I am bitterly opposed to the metaphysical structure of communism as well as Marxism. It is based on what is known as dialectical materialism. I, being an idealist rather than materialist, would reject Marxism at this point. He says all of that and then goes on to justify rights.
Yes, I was about to say that that's all in direct contradiction to his actions and the words that he spoke when he was addressing riots and other such things that were going on in interviews. I would also say that his claim about utopian worldview is slightly hilarious because I think it's very important to point out something, and this is going to be potentially quite a controversial opinion to hold nowadays because of the fact that we have been raised within its paradigm, but that is the fact that the idea of integration itself between disparate races being a solution to many of society's problems and being something that will be a stepping stone to a better society is in itself, historically speaking, looking back throughout all of recorded history prior to around the late 19th and 20th centuries, is a radical idea. Now, you and I, we know plenty of people of different races who are absolutely wonderful and lovely.
Well, I go to a Catholic church in London, so it's pretty hard to not be integrated there.
Of course.
But you're spot on in that if you try and forcibly integrate using the state neighbourhoods together which do not want to mix largely, other than when the civil rights ambassadors for that group say they should do so, and there is no cultural cohesion there, then you get the kind of thing that Robert Putnam observes in Bowling Alone, where the only thing you do by increasing diversity of a neighbourhood is increase television watching, which means you're more atomised, and increase picket marching and protests.
That's absolutely true. And I think it's important to point out that you said there that you interact with a lot of people from different backgrounds through Catholic Church. I think that, along with how shall I put this, state-enforced violence, as we see nowadays in the way that people, from the 1960s when people were forced to integrate at the end of a gun barrel, and then say, for instance, in colonial rule for the British Empire in India, where we kind of forced all of these ethical groups to get along with, different ethnic groups, to get along with each other, basically because we said, well, if you don't, we'll shoot you. Yeah. That's one of the only ways. Or you can have a unifying moral system, unified by something like the Catholic Church, by a religious system. And what we've seen nowadays in the current era is that is not the case. We do not have a unifying moral system. We do not have the only use of force endorsed by the state is always against white populations, majority populations from the Western countries. So reasonably, I think statistically and in practicality, this idea of this forced integration that MLK was advocating for, which, I mean, if you want to classify him as non-violent, just recognize that forced integration requires the force of state violence to incorporate, to administer it in the first place, has been shown to be a utopian idea. And that's one of the other things, like I mentioned, one of the things that you might have seen as being a smear against MLK was that the protests were violent protests. They all turned into riots. This is often portrayed as anti-integrationist propaganda, but as you will see, it is absolutely true that that is what happened. We also have the claim that MLK hated white people, and this is not as cut and dry. People will say that MLK hated white people, and then
He
will
liked
also
some white women.
He definitely liked some white women. I don't think skin color really mattered to him that much when it came to women.
No.
As long as they were willing.
Just quantity. Well, or unwilling, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly, yes. Or willing to accept money. Interestingly enough, very, very pious of him, I'm sure. But once again, this is not as cut and dry. And while he did align himself with a lot of white people, and there were white people that he supported, he, for a general overview, he did despise and want to revolutionize what he considered to be white values. If you go to books that he wrote, such as Where Do We Go From Here, you will see him talking about the idea of white supremacy being something structural, being something inherent in white values, Western values, in the same way that we see a lot of BLM, Ibram X. Kendi, CRT types talking about it today. And then we also have the claim that he and Malcolm X were just two different sides of the civil rights fight. Malcolm X was the extremist radical, and I think we've already addressed that MLK had his own radical views just in this brief overture before we get into the meat of this video. But he already had radical views, but they say that MLK was the moderate, Malcolm X was the radical, and that's as far as it goes. What I think it will become clear is that, in fact, Malcolm X was just far more honest than MLK. Malcolm X was not as eager to work with white people as MLK was, but he was much more honest in his intentions that he hated white people. He was much more honest that he was willing to use violence against white people, whereas I think what MLK represents is the regime-approved moderate veneer that was placed over that. What it was just basically better marketing. We know that if we promote this as violent protests for rights, then we're not going to get as much support from the majority northern supporters, because remember, most of the support the civil rights marches got were from the northern states, which had negligible black populations in comparison to the southern states where these were going on, and often didn't have to face the direct consequences of the riots that were going on. They knew that if they were promoted accurately as being the violent protests that they were, that it would not get as much support from the northern states.
I was going to say, if I can quickly interject,
yes.
We're not going to go in much into Malcolm X here, and it might actually warrant another podcast in the future.
He's an interesting man.
Yes, but if you read Ballot or Bullet, the way he's framing it, and I'm not justifying it, of course, because he might have shot me, but is that he believed that the structural racism imposed on black people required them to defend themselves, and if they were not given all they were owed, such as equal enfranchisement and desegregation, then they would have to fight back and then separate and form a different constituency. This is because he was plugged into Marxism until the end of his life, when he renounced both his Islamic and I think quite a few of his Marxist views, because he didn't think it lined up with it. So Marxism obviously conceptualizes as the proletariat being unduly oppressed by the bourgeoisie, and so Malcolm X did the same thing that CRT types do, and dichotomized as black people being unduly oppressed by white people. So he saw it as self-defense until he renounced his ways. I think MLK saw it in a very similar conceptualization, and so sneakily hid it underneath, where if you look in I Have a Dream speech, there is quite a lot that says there will be an inevitable maelstrom of backlash if the Negro people are not given what they want. And even though there is a large passage...
That's a constant recurring theme throughout all of his speeches and all of his interviews.
There's a large passage where he says we must not revert to our violent ways. However, he then does contradict that when he says riots the language of the unheard, etc., as we'll get into very shortly.
Yes, and just the last thing, none of this whatsoever is to justify the injustices that were done and committed under Southern Jim Crow laws. I am not a supporter of forced separation. At the same time, I am not a supporter of forced integration. I am a supporter of the freedom of association, that people should be able to choose which communities that they want to associate with, and that private property, as a certain right that people should be afforded, should allow people to both associate with whoever they want and also exclude whoever they want from being able to associate on their property. That's pretty simple. I think it's pretty cut and dry. Once again, not supporting any violence that was done by the white Southern side, because all of the violence that was done in this conflict, as far as I'm concerned, was wrong. Anyway, let's get on to the myth. The myth that Republicans and conservatives all across the West have tried to hammer into their own skulls to make them feel better about the gradual repeal both of the American Constitution and of Western civilization in itself, because once again they want to pretend as though MLK was the good one and everything that came after was just something that was anomalous, something diverging from what MLK wanted. So first of all, we've got this Huffington Post article talking about how a billboard went up in Texas that said Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. This is demonstrably false. For instance, in this article, they reference David Garrow, who will be a very important character we reach further down the line when we discuss the FBI files that were released and that he went through. He is one of the most well-known and well-documented and most glowing biographers of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. He said it's simply incorrect to call Dr. King a Republican, which, coming from someone of his stature who has looked through MLK's life, is a pretty clear indication that that's what was the case. Also, MLK III, his own son, as well as various other friends, have objected to the label. So trying to say that he was a Republican is just wrong, because let's remember, I know that some people like to say that MLK III is some kind of traitor to his father's legacy. Please recognize he was raised by this man, and in all likelihood, he knows far more about who MLK really was than any of us do. So if he says MLK was not a Republican, I think we should believe him. Pretty simple there. Then we also have articles from Fox News coping and carrying water for him, making statements like he preferred the power of morality rather than the fame of popularity. The latter has grown throughout the years, giving credence to his statement, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice."
That's not his statement, by the way.
Is it not?
No. He paraphrased it from someone else. I'm sure we can throw out the exact
That's not a
person
surprise
afterwards.
that MLK plagiarized something, as
But that's
we'll
also
find
a
out.
historicist statement, because that believes that history is fixed on a certain path, and therefore
It's a progressive worldview, and to him, Fox News parroting it like it's a positive thing is honestly quite shocking, because they also say here, his insistence on non-violent protest continues to influence many activists pushing for civil rights and social change. And I am shocked that Fox News can publish a statement like that in 2021 when this article was released.
That's Fox and not Vox, correct?
Yes, that is correct. This is Fox News. This is the level of cope that they go to. This is the cognitive dissonance that you have to have when you support MLK's legacy as a conservative or a right-winger. You have to ignore the evidence in front of your own eyes to be able to support the narrative, the abstract falsities that you've got laden in your own head. They say in here, his legacy of service and political empowerment have birthed generations inspired to make political and social order calls for more action in line with King's principles of pacifism and togetherness. I suppose that explains all the riots. And interestingly, despite the fact that they have given him a glowing review with all of these glowing lies, at the bottom of this article, they can't help but let slip this little factoid near the end, which I think is very telling, because remember, the further away you get from an event happening, the harder it is to get to the actual truth of the matter. If you look at things that were being said at the time, the likelihood is they're going to be more accurate. So they say in a 1966 Gallup poll, 63% of the American public rated King negatively. According to an early 1968 Harris poll, the icon died with a public disapproval rating of almost 75%. People despised him, and I will say, rightfully so, given the kind of situations and tensions that he was purposefully causing and causing riots as a result. After King was assassinated, 31% of Americans, 31% told Gallup that they said that they felt he brought it on himself. So it seems that there was a pretty distinct and massive public backlash against what he was doing. We've also got National Review. Surprise, surprise, National Review, the supposedly conservative publication.
Can I
yeah.
read a little quote here, because they're not quite right.
All right.
King's challenge to the nation's social scientists. So this is in the American Psychological Association, so one of those crackpot conspiracy theory websites. He said, urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or to attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. There are thus elements of emotional catharsis in the violent act. It is also noteworthy that the amount of physical harm done to white people other than the police is infinitesimal on Detroit whites and Negroes looted in utility. And he says here, a profound judgment of today's riots was expressed by Victor Hugo a century ago. He said, if a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. The policymakers of white society have caused the darkness. That could be written by Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Yes. Interestingly enough, given how King said repeatedly how he wanted to stoke tensions to force the hand of legislators, it's very interesting that he attributes the blame on the person causing the conditions in the first place. So obviously he didn't cause Jim Crow, but if he then orchestrates a situation that creates tensions which lead to a riot, surely by his own logic, he would also be equally culpable for that riot.
He is saying the housing situations that have been created by local governments is itself violence. The best one here is, let us say boldly that if the violations to the law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the law breaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. So that's saying we can smash up stores, but because of legacies of systemic racism, if you do a moral calculus, the ephemeral white person who has historic guilt for putting people that look like me in a state of oppression has more responsibility than the person that broke the window in the first place.
Yeah, well, it's just Angela Davis. That's an Angela Davis talking point when repeatedly in the 1970s, when black radicals and members of the Black Panther Party would go out and just murder white people in the street because they said, oh, you're a racist. Angela Davis would repeatedly come out and say things like, he didn't pull that trigger, racism pulled that trigger, which is just a more succinct way of saying exactly the sentiment that MLK was getting across in that quote that you just gave us there. We've also got the Daily Wire, the Daily Wire carrying water for him from an article from PragerU, where they say, since the death of Dr. King, radical activists have rejected King's message of equality and freedom. Once again, can we please understand on the right, this is why the leftists keep winning, because they understand the legacy of people like MLK, whereas the right, for some reason, I can kind of understand the political tactic of trying reappropriate the enemy's icons as your own, as some kind of own against them, but it doesn't work.
I also think that, frankly, a lot of the time they've only read the I Have a Dream speech. I do think that's just an issue.
Probably the case.
Because the I Have a Dream speech is largely non-negotiably good, right? It is a very well-written doctrine.
Also not written by him.
Shockingly so. So the content of character, colour of skin thing is a non-objectionable statement, but if you don't read beyond that into his legacy, you're going to fall into a lot of pitfalls and end up arguing on the left's terms, specifically around the civil rights framing of legislation, which is a superimposition on the Constitution. Which
oh yes, it's a replacement constitution, as we'll get onto. One of the books that I did read for this, which is excellent to go through if you get the opportunity, it's available on Amazon, it's not too expensive, is Christopher Caldwell's The Age of Entitlement, which goes through painstaking detail exactly how it is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the legislation that came off the back of that, and we'll get into a little bit of it as we go along, ended up basically repealing the United States Constitution from 1789 and replacing it with the new civil rights doctrines, which have led to everything that we complain about on a day-to-day basis here. Diversity, affirmative action, racial quotas and sexual quotas, all of this. But I just want to read a bit more of this PragerU because it's hilarious how much cope and how much it reads like lying to yourself. The pretenders to King's legacy mostly ignore this advice, preferring instead to keep the onus on whites, he says. Where King tried to instill the importance of personal responsibility and self-determination, questionable, his counterparts today spend more time making excuses for counterproductive behavior and dismissing any criticism of it as racist. They carry on. Racial gaps in income, education, and home ownership were narrowing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Only till about midway through the 1960s,
when
interestingly enough. Something happened. We'll get Tom Harwood on the case. But after King was replaced as the spokesman for Black America by the likes of Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others, these gaps began to widen in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Please bear in mind, Jesse Jackson was friends with King, was a personal correspondent of King's, and a fellow political radical activist with King. So if you're saying that Jesse Jackson, when he took over, that's when everything went, please bear in mind that Jesse Jackson had many personal conversations with MLK that we are not all privy to, in which case those more radical elements of Jackson's beliefs were probably mirrored by MLK. So please bear that in mind. We also have this horrible article, sorry Matt Walsh, from Matt Walsh, where he talks about how those FBI files were released that document MLK's multiple affairs and his one potential, how would you call it? He would be an accomplice to rape.
Party to it, yes.
He would be a accomplice party to rape, and says, should we tear his monuments down? And then he says, well, we don't erase anyone from the history books just because they had personal flaws, even very serious flaws. But perhaps we add another page or two. This is all very magnanimous, Matt. It's all very fair of you to say, we keep the monuments because the monuments are part of our history and culture, but we keep in mind that the person commemorated by that monument was just that, a person. Now, this is a standard that I can hold when it comes to people whose legacies are ones that I can agree with and ones that I can say have been positive. So, for instance, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. That's something I disagree with. But he was part of the founding of the United States, which, given its stated principles when it was founded and the lives that it's allowed, the prosperous lives that it's allowed many to lead over the coming centuries after it was founded, is a very positive legacy. So I can say, yes, Jefferson did some bad things, said some bad things, but his legacy overall is positive. It's led to many benefits for many, many people. So therefore, it's a good thing we shouldn't tear down his monuments. We should remember the good with the bad. MLK's legacy, not so much.
Well, Karl Marx has a monument in Highgate Cemetery, and it was defaced a couple of years ago with writings in red paint about how many millions of lives communism had claimed. And I saw plenty of people, online conservatives on Twitter, leaping to the defense of the statue saying we should not denigrate this. I don't think we need to be value neutral as to the kind of monument we would like to have up. It expresses something particular about the values we wish to hold and the culture we wish to affirm. And unfortunately, if we decide to be nihilistic, that will only be exploited by cynical leftists who will tear down our monuments and instead put up these false idols in their place.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.